Okay, welcome everybody to Real Mushrooms Practitioner Roundtable number 22. It's amazing to think that we've done 22 of these now, looking back, but we've got an interesting lineup set up for tonight, and we're going to be talking all about metabolic disease. So we're joined here with myself. I'm Dr. Mason Brissett, Chief Science Advisor at Real Mushrooms, if you haven't met me. And we've also got Dr. Rob Silver here, Chief Veterinarian Officer for Real Mushrooms. And we're also happy to have Lee Carroll. And Lee Carroll is a medical herbalist, and he's been with us a few times now, and he'll be starting off the discussion about metabolic disease. Just some housekeeping before we get going. Like I said, this is the 22nd roundtable, so we meet monthly to try to get together to talk about different topics. Sometimes it's condition-based, sometimes it's practitioner sort of skill-based, but next month, we've got a veterinarian-focused roundtable, and that's Dr. Judy Morgan joining us. And in October, we're going to be having Amanda Jones. I believe I'm getting her name correct. And she's going to be talking all about inflammation and medicinal mushrooms. And in November, we've got a couple special guests lined up. And what do you think? Should we let that out of the bag here already, or should we keep that a secret, Joni?
Well, I already announced it in the a practitioner newsletter, so the cat is somewhat out of the bag already.
Okay.
But you, yeah, because I think people, if they should, block it off on their calendar so they can attend.
Yes, and I'll have to double back on the dates, but we've got Jeff Chilton joining us in November to talk all about mushrooms. And Jeff's a very, one of the most well-researched and informed people in the medicinal mushroom world, especially the mycology analytical space. So we're going to be really happy to have him. And he's the founder of Namex Mushrooms, which is our parent company. And we've also got Rosemary Gladstar coming to do some informative talks on herbs and mushrooms in November as well. So we're really looking forward to those two roundtables. So we'll keep you posted with the dates within the emails with Roundtable emails and Real Mushrooms emails. And then I'm sure we'll talk more about it later. And some exciting stuff at the end of today's session, as well as Lee is going to be going through a brief intro on his new clinical mushroom course. So please stick around for that, as we're going to be taking 5 to 10 minutes to really go through that, because it's going to be a great course and it's going to be really informative. So stick around for that, as that's going to be at the end of tonight's roundtable session. So I think that's all. But yeah, tell your friends, tell your colleagues that we're doing these monthly, and we'll get started with Lee. Lee's going to start us off with talking about metabolic disease, a brief sort of starting point on the physiology and whatnot behind it. So welcome, everyone. And if you're new, please put your name and where you're from and what kind of practitioner you are in the chat.
Thanks, Mason, and evening, everybody. Great to see all the faces here tonight to hear about metabolic disease. In 2019, I was doing seminar tours in the US talking about herbal medicine and its application for metabolic syndrome. So it's a topic that I'm reasonably current in, and obviously it's a significant health burden in the broader population. And metabolic syndrome you could see as a portal or a gateway to the future development of all of the metabolic diseases that we encounter. And about 25% of the adults in the US fit the definition of metabolic syndrome. That number increases to about 40% by the time they get to 60. And it's a very worrying trend that the number of adolescents with metabolic syndrome is increasing significantly. There's about 10% of adolescents. So, as many of us will be aware, metabolic syndrome is defined by central adiposity and impaired fasting glucose, some hypertension, and atherogenic dyslipidemia. So the definitions vary around the world a little bit, but they all coalesce on the fact that patient would need to have 3 of those dysfunctions to make it into that disease category. So it's technically an insulin-resistant state that's driven by chronic low-grade or meta-inflammation. It has in the background microvascular disturbance and elements of prothrombotic blood. So if a patient has metabolic syndrome, they technically don't have, a disease per se, but they are at much greater risk for the development of future diseases. So twice the risk of large artery or cardiovascular disease. They've got 5 times the risk of type 2 diabetes, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Some researchers suggest that in some patient populations, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease may be a precursor to the development of metabolic syndrome. Whichever way you look at it, they're very, very closely related. Gout is significantly correlated, and there's a bit of a misunderstanding, I think, around the danger of uric acid and gout. The definition of having gout is where you've got levels of uric acid that would come out out of solution into crystals in the bloodstream. But with uric acid, you only have to have minor increases within the normal reference range to increase your chances of having metabolic syndrome. So every 1 milligram per deciliter above 4 increases your chance of developing metabolic syndrome by about 30%. So uric acid, we can talk about that a little bit later, but it's a very significant player in the developmental etiology of this. Polycystic ovarian syndrome, chronic kidney diseases, a whole bunch of male aging disorders like erectile dysfunction and BPH, for example. Metabolic syndrome isn't linked to the development of cancer, but it's linked to poorer cancer outcomes and increased risk of recurrence. The list is really quite long. It keeps on going. There's microvascular diseases, and hypothyroidism is more significantly associated, a bunch of autoimmune diseases, mood disorders, migraines, etc. So we're really looking at the full brunt of what we see in a clinical setting when patients come to visit us, and having an understanding of what the causes, for this developmental trajectory is what informs us in terms of what we're going to do, from a clinical point of view. So there are some things that we don't have control over, like early life stress. The developing fetus and very young children are very epigenetically adaptable, and early life stress significantly dysregulates glucocorticoid, mineralocorticoid receptors, the endocannabinoid system, and children that are born as a result of experiencing stress are more likely to have these metabolic disturbances. These types of patients are more difficult to deal with in terms of their stress responses, and they're a little bit more difficult to manage in a clinical setting. But our sedentary lifestyles, our lack of exercise play a big role. Unregulated nutrient flux, so especially fructose and overeating are significant factors in this. It's not just about the calories, it's about the metabolic consequences. When we overeat, we put pressure on the liver, for example, and when the liver has high nutrients and low oxygen, it turns on the hepatorenal reflexes, which is something that isn't widely understood or talked about, and that increases the capacity for hypertension and kidney dysfunction. The elevated consumption of fructose leads to increases in uric acid, which sets the scene for vascular damage. Uric acid at normal levels is an antioxidant in the blood. When it exceeds those normal levels, it leaves the bloodstream and enters the endothelial cells and the surrounding tissues, where it becomes pro-inflammatory and it causes disease. The lifestyle and the diet create dysbiosis, the lack of fiber. The American diet is significantly deficient in fiber, so dysbiosis is now recognized as a key driver of the development of metabolic syndrome. So we've got low levels of diversity now in many patients. and we have disrupted balance. So there's low levels of beneficial organisms and higher levels of organisms which are less helpful. So you could, if you're putting that into classes, the Firmicutes is elevated and the Bacteroides is reduced, and that sets the scene for a pro-inflammatory environment. So you get a more leaky gut. You've got the more production of lipopolysaccharide. You've got bits and pieces of food fragments and all sorts of stuff that leak into the portal vein, which puts pressure on the liver. And when we're talking about insulin resistance, and this is an insulin resistant state, we've got peripheral insulin resistance and we have liver insulin resistance. So when the liver gets disturbed with the flow of all of this, basically, rubbish, if you want to use a generic term, coming into the liver, it disturbs the liver, it creates an inflammatory state. The liver's already burdened because of the excess nutrients, and the liver can only process so much fructose. Fructose doesn't get taken up by cells anywhere else in the body. So if the liver's beavering away to remove or to metabolize the fructose, it uses up all of the cellular energy, if you like, which renders the hepatocytes less capable of doing all of their other jobs. And this sets the scene for the development of the liver dysfunction. So dysbiosis is a significant piece of the equation, and it's a very significant aspect that mushrooms bring to the table when we're talking about helping patients with this type of condition. I think the polysaccharides in general play an enormous role in changing the diversity, increasing the production of short-chain fatty acids, altering the health of the gastrointestinal linings, reducing the leakiness of the gut, for example. This plays into the portal theory, which is essentially that patients with metabolic syndrome typically have got some visceral adiposity, and it's the visceral fat that is attached to the liver and the greater and lesser omentum, and the fat around the GIT. So this visceral fat it behaves differently. So it produces all sorts of inflammatory mediators that leak into the portal blood. Adiponectin and leptin, which regulate insulin sensitivity, get dysregulated. So there's elevated leptin, but it becomes resistant. So the body's not getting those signals. Adipolectin is low, and you see increases in a whole bunch of inflammatory mediators like tumor necrosis factor alpha and interleukin-6, for example. But the list is really quite long. We get microvascular dysfunction. So when we're talking about microvascular health and insulin resistance, it's kind of like the chicken and the egg. Which one comes first? Well, it's quite conclusive that just regular consumption of sugary foods, in the absence of any overt disease, the endothelial cells take up glucose without the need for insulin. So if there's high levels of glucose in the bloodstream, there'll be high levels of glucose in the endothelial cells. And the endothelial cells can only process so much glucose at a certain rate. So if the concentration of glucose in the endothelial cells exceeds that natural metabolic process, then the glucose starts to go down different pathways, which lead ultimately to dysfunction in the endothelial cells. And when the endothelial cells become dysfunctional, they then can't regulate the delivery of glucose into the subsequent tissues. So you get higher levels of glucose in the bloodstream, which creates an insulin resistance. So a number of researchers suggest that the insulin resistance happens, long before, we get overt disease. And there's longitudinal studies now that show that going back to dysbiosis, that patients that end up with with the consequences of metabolic syndrome, so cardiovascular disease, you can see the changes in the microbiota long before the development of the disease process. So the microbiota is like an early kind of forerunner, or it's an early signal that there's the future development possibilities around these diseases. Toxins play an important role in the development of metabolic syndrome. It's not just internal toxins that we were just talking about. So the development of advanced glycation end products and methyl glyoxal and the consequences of, you know, the inappropriate dietary patterns that exist. But it's also environmental toxins. So patients that have metabolic syndrome are more likely to be exposed to, you know, the whole gamut of environmental toxins. Patients with metabolic syndrome in areas that are more toxic, like, you know, the northeast of the US gets more air pollution because of the prevailing winds. And patients with metabolic syndrome spend more time in hospital. They're less well. I talked about uric acid. That's considered an internal toxin. And then we have the drugs. So antibiotics will disrupt the microbiota, but antibiotics also are known to cause disruption and challenges and stress in mitochondria. So regular consumption of antibiotics alters the mitochondrial dynamics in the endothelial cells, as does the toxic molecules that we might get from air pollution, that they also cause damage to mitochondria. And then when endothelial cell mitochondria and then the vascular tissue mitochondria lose their capacity, they remodel the vascular system to reduce the luminal space because they can't control the same amount of blood flow, and that helps to feed into the development of cardiovascular disease and reduced blood flow. So and it's not just antibiotics that affect microbiota. There's a whole range of other drug classes that we take, like antipsychotic class of drugs, proton pump inhibitors. These all have quite selective negative effects on the microbiota, which can lead into the development of dysbiosis. Circadian rhythms and sleep quality. If you sleep less than 7 hours a night, if you sleep between 5 and 6 hours a night, you're much more likely to develop metabolic syndrome and the downstream consequences. Long sleep is also, if you sleep more than 9 hours a day, that's also implicated. So there's a short list of the developmental factors that you know, play into the development of it, and that guides us then in terms of, you know, how do we consider mushrooms, you know, fitting into this type of scenario. So that allows us to generate a bunch of targets, if you like, or develop a range of therapeutic goals that we would want to achieve. So obviously there's the visceral adiposity, the blood sugar, the lipids, and the cholesterol, and the high blood pressure. But we've got the gastrointestinal microbiota. We also have to consider the oral microbiome as well. Bacteria that inhabit the mouth are very closely associated with the development of atherosclerosis and the future risk of heart attack and stroke. So mushrooms, particularly shiitakes, got some good evidence for, particularly shiitake drinks, for reducing or supporting the oral microbiome. But we need to focus on making sure we look after the microcirculation and the vascular endothelium. We need to be focused on supporting the detoxification processes in the body. We need to be focused on increasing the quantity of brown fat and improving the way that uncoupling protein, you know, burns off excess energy. We need to be focused on sleep. So, you know, a mushroom like reishi has a reputation for improving sleep. And in animal studies now, that relationship is being shown to be a relationship based on the interaction of the polysaccharides and the triterpenes affecting the bowel flora, altering the byproducts of fermentation of those molecules, circulating in the body, improving the way that the brain works, improving sleep. Stress is a big factor. So if we've got mushrooms or herbs that can put stress responses and coping mechanisms, the endocannabinoid system plays a role. In metabolic syndrome, there's an increased tone in the endocannabinoid system. So there's typically increased levels of endocannabinoids, and some of the molecules, some of the ethanolamines that get produced in the gut as a result of the dysbiosis can interact with CB1 receptors, and this turns down the functionality of many cells and creates the scenario that sets the scene for metabolic syndrome. So the solution isn't necessarily taking cannabinoid regulating herbs. The solution there is to get the microbiota back into a more healthy and functional state. And we need to have a strong focus on the liver, and obviously, depending on the comorbidities that are present, we need to have a focus on those comorbidities, and particularly the organs that are under stressful settings. So the heart, the brain, the kidneys, for example. So that's a brief introduction to what we're dealing with in terms of the constellation of metabolic diseases. And I think from here it would be good to discuss what are the various constituents in mushrooms that we could be focused on and that could fit into that sort of strategy, and then look at some of the research that backs up the use of mushrooms in these metabolic conditions. So Mason, I'll hand it back to you.
Thanks, Lee. Thanks for giving us an overview there of the good background there, as always. Yeah, so let's get into some constituents and some mushrooms, and maybe talk about some use cases later. So some of the the most common active compounds in mushrooms are the beta glucans, which we know have that fiber effect, like Lee was talking about earlier. So we know that they have sort of a multifunctional role here in terms of just slowing down glucose absorption, leveling off that gastric emptying, things like that. So we can't skip over these ones for sure. So I'll just name a few, and then we'll kind of go through some questions or add in any here. But there's a lot of studies too, and this isn't a huge factor on sort of the insulin load or anything, but ergothioneine is always coming up in some of these papers relating to metabolic disease, and kind of like Lee was alluding to with the dysbiosis and all the inflammation going on in the body. Mushrooms can play a huge role in just being a healthy part of the diet, kind of reducing some of that processed food and the refined nature of some of that food, creating that oxidation, which leads to the lipid peroxidation and things like that. But yeah, the ergothioneine is interesting because of the high oxidative stress role that a dysregulated metabolic system puts on the body, because it's so important. So looking at a compound like that, it becomes very relevant. And each mushroom is sort of has its own immune potential, we know, and it also has its own varying structure and secondary compounds, like the triterpenoids in reishi, we know, are very anti-inflammatory. And a big condition that some people get when they do have long-term metabolic disease is peripheral neuropathy. And mushrooms can also be a big supporting role there, whether it's compounds in lion's mane, or looking at maybe some of reishi's interesting impacts to reduce sorbitol, which is an interesting sugar that is elevated usually in some of these patients. So these are some of the constituents that come to my mind when just kind of doing a brief overview here. Rob, do you have anything to add as we kind of go through some constituents and different types of mechanisms here?
Well, I will say that we don't have metabolic syndrome in veterinary species, in part because we don't have problems with cholesterol creating atherosclerosis and cardiovascular disease. we do have type 1 and type 2 diabetes. And in the horse, we see a syndrome where you have obesity and insulin resistance combined with a tendency to develop a vasculitis in the foot that in the horse is called laminitis. I think a lot of the principles we're discussing here can be useful for those animals who have a hypertriglyceridemia or are obese, who have problems with hyperglycemia. But per se, we just don't see metabolic syndrome. I did a literature review before this just to double check that, because Lee always comes so well prepared. I wanted to make sure I had a few arrows in my quiver. And so that's really my best contribution as far as that. I think the constituents, the use of the mushrooms, the fiber for balancing microbiome, I think these are all very valuable tools to use in our veterinary species.
Thanks, Rob.
Yeah. Perhaps the one that we could add, Mason, is the mycosterols, which regulate cholesterol and lipids. So fungi have got ergosterol, which is analogous to human cholesterol. So the machinery within a mushroom has got all of the wisdom and understanding around how to regulate and keep healthy those cholesterol elements. So the production of them, the degradation of them, the health maintenance of them. So that particularly in oyster mushrooms, I think those elements play an important role.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that one up, Lee. That's a big one with the statins, the natural statins there, and the different oyster compounds. So I think we touched on most of the constituents that are kind of topic. Some of the big mushrooms that we wanted to signify have an effect with this condition. Most mushrooms, because of their fiber content, because of their active compound content, have a role to play. It seems like the research has a few more studies in some mushrooms compared to others, directly relating to anything metabolic. There's all these indirect kind of connections, which is amazing when you get into the labyrinth of medicinal mushroom research. It's not for the faint of heart, I find. But reishi seems to have some evidence. Oyster mushroom, as Lee was discussing, seems to have some interesting discussions around specifically, the sugar load and the blood pressure, and some lipid studies. And then lion's mane indirectly with the neuropathy, as we mentioned. And white button mushroom seems to be another big one that has some impacts on this. Shiitake seems to be faring well in some of the studies. And then also, turkey tail is a great modulator of the biome, I find. So that one's not usually mentioned, but indirectly, I think it's a great one just to keep in the discussion. Lee, does that sound like some of the big ones? Would you like to add any favorite mushrooms into the group there?
Yeah, they're the key ones that you just mentioned. As I've been developing my course, I've had my head in all of the research, and it's been taking me, a long time to get my head around the full, depth of the topic. And there's a lot of research that uses very highly purified polysaccharides that give all of these wonderful effects in animal models. But when you actually, and it's quite hard to get access to the concentration and the production methods that are used to make these things. So it takes multiple goes at looking at the research to finally develop like an understanding. But some of these impressive results that we see in animal studies, I don't think can translate into the humans, because we're not using the types of preparations that match the strength that is used in the clinical study. So reishi polysaccharides have got some wonderful effects in cardiovascular disease, for example. But when you look at the extracts that are being used, when you do the translation, so if you take the polysaccharide and then work out what weight of mushroom is being used, you're looking at a minimum of like 40 grams of reishi, but there's a product called Ganopoly. So Ganoderma polysaccharides, and it's a highly specialized polysaccharide from Ganoderma. It doesn't have any of the triterpenes. And in the clinical studies that demonstrate value in cardiovascular disease with that particular product, it equates to 270 grams of reishi a day, which is just, it's quite unachievable, in terms of, what we're going to be able to do in clinic, unless you have access to those products. And some of those products are hard to get, and they're very expensive. So I think we need to rely on the more the culinary mushrooms to start with. I think is the primary place that we can get the most traction, with our patients. And there's a couple of studies that have looked at replacing meat with mushrooms in diets. And there's a couple of studies that just look at giving people mushrooms to eat as a regular part of their diet for in some cases for quite long periods of time, like up to a year. So if you feed someone, 3 8-ounce meals of mushrooms a week, if they're already obese, and you feed them 3 8-ounce meals of mushrooms a week and do nothing else, over the course of a year, they can lose significant amounts of weight. They can be, clinically relevant reductions in their fasting blood glucose, some of their antioxidant measures, their lipids, for example. So focusing because with metabolic syndrome, it's got to be a whole lifestyle change. You can't just supplement your way out of this. So I'm currently, a big fan of introducing at least a pound of fresh mushrooms a week, and of any type of mushroom. But if you're going by the evidence, oyster mushroom gives the best bang for the buck, and they're relatively easily available. And then all of the lifestyle modifications, and then on top of that, use the mushroom extracts as a therapy on top of that. And reishi and shiitake and lion's mane, maitake has got some evidence for lowering blood sugar. There's a clinical study with maitake improving fertility in women with PCOS. So PCOS is one of the comorbidities of metabolic syndrome. So if a female patient presents with that, then maitake is going to be, a more sensible choice, from that point of view. And then from a nerve point of view, it's not just about lion's mane, but also tremella. So we could add tremella into that category. Tremella exerts some incredible influences over the nervous system that aren't often talked about. It also has got some evidence for supporting the blood lipids and lowering blood sugar as well. Yeah.
Thanks, Lee. Yeah, I didn't know that about tremella. You have to share some of those with me. I've seen some of those maitake studies for sure. Does anybody have any? Go ahead, Lee.
The challenge with tremella is that when you look at the studies, they're all using a tremella polysaccharide, and it's about I found some patents. I went and looked at the extraction procedures, and tremella polysaccharide's about a 50-to-1 concentration. So you need 50 times the mushroom weight to get the same benefit in a clinical study. So in Australia, I have access to a 10-to-1 tremella extract, which is reasonably good quality. So in the studies that were done, 600 milligrams of polysaccharide or 1200 milligrams of polysaccharide were used for the cognitive benefits. But in the animal studies that drive the metabolic stuff, they're using similar extracts at similar doses. So that translates into about 30 grams of tremella per day. So if anybody's ever cooked with tremella, that's almost impossible to do because they're when you soak it, one floret or rosette or whatever you want to call the gross form of it, when it absorbs all the water, it's quite large. I've been cooking stews and soups and things with it. It's quite amazing. But this 10-to-1 extract, I've been using 20 grams a day with patients, and I'm getting excellent results with skin. And I have a patient that has nerve damage as a result of a viral infection, and they walk with a limp, and they've lost control of their bowel and their bladder to a certain extent. And I'm using Real Mushrooms lion's mane. Thank you for those capsules, Mason. So I'm using the capsules that you sent me, and this patient in 9 weeks, they've got an improvement in the capacity to control their calf muscles, which they never had before. They were never able to flex their calf muscles. They can now, and they're starting to get a tingling in their legs, which they've never had before, which I believe is like a forerunner to the nerves, like repairing and restoring themselves. And I asked this patient about their skin, and they said, "Yeah, curious you asked that, because my skin's the best it's ever been, and my skin's usually dry in winter, and I haven't had to use nearly as much moisturizer as I have, and it's got a shine about it that I haven't ever recognized before." So, and tremella is profound in the way that it alters the microbiome. So I think that any mushroom that a patient would take is going to have significant impact on the microbiome. And there's a plethora, is probably a good word to describe the number of studies for Ganoderma polysaccharides in altering gut flora. And it's the higher molecular weight polysaccharides that have the most influence. They measure polysaccharides by Dalton's is a molecular weight measure, so kilodalton. So if you're above 300 kilodaltons, and a glucose molecule weighs 180 daltons, so if you divide the number by 180, you get how many glucose molecules are in there. But the influence over the microbiota, so increased diversity, improvement in short chain fatty acids, improvement in colonocyte health, improvement in integrity of the lining, so less leakiness, for example. So a product that's a 1-to-1 extract of reishi that's got all of the polysaccharides still present, and I think the Real Mushrooms products around 15% polysaccharides or beta glucans at a minimum. So there's a clinical trial on reishi. And there's also meta-analyses, and 3 grams of reishi in a very, very well constructed clinical trial didn't have any changes over 16 weeks in any of the primary or secondary categories or outcome measures for a whole range of metabolic and cardiovascular issues. So you have to ask yourself the question, is those trials will inform the practitioner community that reishi, may not be all it's hyped up to be, because, the preceding meta-analysis came to that same conclusion. But I think it's all about dose. It's probably about the quality of the extract, and this paper didn't define the quality of the reishi extract. And it's also about the timing and understanding, what timeframes are needed to make the changes. So I think 3 grams of reishi is probably a bit on the low side. I think probably needs to be more like 5 and 6 grams of reishi to drive these benefits. And short timeframes don't deliver clinically relevant outcomes. Something like reishi needs to be engaged in as a lifestyle practice. Like we engage in coffee as a lifestyle practice. We like the flavor, the taste, we like what it does to our brain. We need to develop relationships like that, with these, mushroom medicines to get the best long-term benefit out of them. But The number of studies in humans is very, very small compared to the number of studies in animals. And I think the big issue is these ridiculously high concentrations of polysaccharides that get used, and hardly any of the research is conducted using whole mushroom extracts, which is, where we're focused in terms of a clinical setting. So there aren't currently, even though ergothioneine ticks all the boxes as a molecule, and it's necessary for human health, particularly in this category, there aren't currently any studies. So you can look at the whole mushroom clinical trials and say that there's a paper by a person called Dix, which is a systematic review and meta-analysis that looks at quite a lot of oyster mushroom studies, and oyster mushrooms are the most studied in this category. And you could argue that, oyster mushrooms are high in polysaccharides, they're very high in ergothioneine, they're very high in ergosterol and a bunch of other, important molecules. So that could be like a default trial to demonstrate the benefits of ergothioneine. But if we wanted to look at, some of the other studies, there's a bunch of ones that I've got loaded up that we could talk about. There's some interesting data there. But should we see if there's any questions first?
Yeah, let's do that. How's everybody doing? Anybody got any questions about anything that Lee or I or Rob or anybody has mentioned so far? Or anything new to chat about that you think is relevant? You can unmute yourself, or if you're on your phone or whatever, you can throw it in the chat, whatever works.
Yeah. While we're waiting for the question to pop up, there was a large prospective study done in China. Nearly 20,000 people were monitored over 4 years, and they had the patients that had the highest levels of mushroom consumption had significantly reduced levels of uric acid in their blood. So, just on that one marker, that's lowering uric acid is quite an important feature, and uric acid never gets talked about. 25,000 Chinese adults were assessed for their mushroom consumption, and those that ate more mushrooms had very strong inverse relationship with the development of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, for example. So, the message keeps on coming back that the most important thing we can do in a clinical setting is get patients to eat more mushrooms, and whether that's a mushroom as a food or whether it's a mushroom as an extract, particularly a whole extract, a 1-in-1 extract, is where we need to be focused.
Yeah, I find soups, elixirs, just mushrooms fried up if they're okay, and some fat for some of my patients are the three kind of easiest ways that I recommend folks get them in. And they're so versatile, obviously, with all these vegetarian and vegan recipes out there too. So they're very easy to work with in terms of recipes for patients and whatnot out there these days. Okay. Anybody got any metabolic questions or any discussion points? If not, we'll keep going through some of the interesting findings that Lee and I have been discovering.
There was a study published in last year, and it was looking at the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey data between 2013 2014, and they also did a meta-analysis of all of the previous Haynes research that had been published, and they found that regular consumption of mushrooms decrease the risk of all-cause mortality. So the more mushrooms you eat, the less you're going to die, from any cause, not just from, the consequences of metabolic syndrome, which we're talking about here. So we just don't know. We've got to get that message out, more loudly and more clearly.
Yeah, and that's a good one there. And there's another long-term study. I think it was over 10 years that shows that somebody was asking me about purines earlier. So they were wondering about a gout patient, and if they could eat mushrooms. And I had seen that over, I think it was a 10-year observation study, that mushroom consumption, the higher end of those folks have a lesser chance of gout. So looking at that kidney and uric acid connection again.
Oh, it totally makes sense. Yeah. And for a uric acid lowering herb, mushroom, I think about chaga. There's some animal data that strongly suggests inhibition of xanthine oxidase, so less production of uric acid. So 3 grams of chaga a day, would be an ideal dose for that. And as an adjunct, I would add reishi for the endothelial support that reishi offers. Uric acid's also in part a factor of dysbiosis. So depending on the types of bacteria that you have, you can be better at breaking down these molecules, and uric acid can be produced in the gut and get reabsorbed through the lining of the gut. So a hidden source of uric acid can be microbial production. So if there's certain bacteria in the gut, I've forgotten their names now, but they're strongly implicated in the development of gout. So the mushrooms would play a big role in improving the microbiota environment that would lessen the gouty burden.
I think the bacteria name is Oxalobacter, I think.
Oxalobacter, yeah, that's it.
Is that the one?
Yeah, but there's a bunch of other organisms that can also do the degrading, but that's the main one. And not everybody has it.
Yeah, and I know that one's susceptible to antibiotic use as well, specifically.
Yeah, and it can the antibiotics just totally wipe it out. And once you've wiped it out, I think the only way to get it back is with a fecal transplant, because there's no oral option there. Those organisms don't survive production, so you can't have a probiotic with them. Sorry.
Yeah, and the timing, as Lee was saying, timing over days, months, years is sometimes important to consider when looking at this, as well as the quality of the product. And then just timing for meals, if you're using it for that postprandial modulation of the glucose spike, dosing with meals is a very important strategy I do in my clinic, especially when working with any of these folks. And if you're eating the mushrooms, obviously you're getting them right there in the meal. But if you're using a capsule or a powder, I do that often with meals. You're still going to get some benefits if you're using some of those other compounds like the statins and other active compounds, but specifically for the fiber impact, very, very beneficial, I find, when looking at glucose checks and CGMs and stuff with folks using different supplements and mushrooms in their protocols.
Yeah. So
hey guys, this is Press. Hey Lee, how you doing, buddy?
Hi Press, good to see you.
Good to see you as well.
Your picture, I should say.
I'm smiling on the inside. I just thought that the topic today was really timely, and I'm really thankful for it. And of course, your information is always, so fresh. And I was looking at today an article literally talking about gout and uric acid levels and insulin resistance as it related to metabolic syndrome. And just a comment that I thought would be helpful, because it was surprising to me, was on one level, the BMI, a normal BMI, they can still have metabolic syndrome, of course. We kind of know that, but I just saw it measured in actual uric acid levels. And for a normal BMI, a uric acid level of less than 6 milligrams per deciliter, the prevalence of metabolic syndrome is of just 5.9%, compared to a staggering, 59%, 10 times higher among those with a uric acid level of 10 milligrams per deciliter. That was the first point of that article, and I thought that was pretty timely to the topic that you opened up with today. And the other piece that I thought was fascinating is that a study had showed that increased dietary protein, and this is to someone's comment about are mushrooms appropriate given the carb. It said increased dietary protein may actually be beneficial for individuals with gout, provided that carbohydrate intake is reduced. Noting the dietary advice for people with gout typically calls for limiting protein, encouraging the unlimited use of several food substances high in carbohydrates. But again, for years we've been talking about avoid high purine foods. Now it's basically saying, hey, that's more of a carbohydrate ratio, which totally makes sense, and actually increased protein intake may be helpful.
Yeah, well, thanks, Press. That's quite insightful. And that uric acid number that you quoted, I think the definition of gout kicks in at 9 milligrams per deciliter. So what that's saying is anybody with gout's got metabolic syndrome. So yeah.
So how does that relate to the mushrooms dietarily? Aren't they higher in fiber and protein, and therefore they would be complementary aside from the research that you've quoted?
Yeah, they will be complementary. Yeah, I think the protein question of how much to have and what's too much. I think the thing that often gets left out of that discussion is what the impact on the dysbiosis factor in the gut, and high consumption of meat changes the ratios of the bacteria to create a microbiota environment that in the long term will create more disease. So in the short term, it may reduce weight, for example, but too much, particularly too much meat, has a significant impact on the metabolite profiles that get produced by those microbiota. So you get an increase in TMAO, which is quite highly implicated in the development of cardiovascular disease. And then in this category of metabolic syndrome, I didn't mention it earlier on, but levels of iron in the body are they're quite closely correlated with the development of type 2 diabetes. So if we have too much iron stored as ferritin, it changes the oxidative nature in the environment of the cells, which render them more likely to be insulin resistant and develop diabetes. So when you drill into the detail, there's some mitigating factors against how much protein and where that protein comes from. So eating meat is going to increase your exposure to to iron, whereas if you ate chicken or fish, it would lower that burden, so to speak. So the studies that showed that the obese patients that had 8 ounces of mushrooms substituted for 3 meals per week, they did significantly well on a whole bunch of measures. I think I've got the numbers here. Yeah, that study is by a guy called Podar, and patients lost, after a year, they lost 7 pounds, their BMI and their total. So their weight loss and their BMI loss were, the p-value was 0. So there was absolutely no chance, that was just a fluke. Their total body fat was reduced, their systolic and diastolic blood pressure reduced, their fasting blood glucose, their lipid profile, their triglycerides, their inflammatory markers, so highly sensitive CRP was also improved. So just substituting simply mushrooms, for meat, has some quite profound influences. And these were people that didn't meet all of the criteria for a healthy lifestyle. So, and they weren't doing anything else. So in a clinical setting, we don't only ever use just, one serve of mushrooms 3 times a week. We're not just using mushrooms, but, we've got berberine and nigella and, bioavailable curcumin and cinnamon and all of these other things, which, are incredibly profound, in their own right. Yeah.
That's excellent, Lee. Thanks for letting me share. You guys are doing great.
Yeah. Thanks, Press. Good to hear your voice.
Yeah, thanks, Press. I'm going to look at my metabolic patients a little bit more closely and see what their uric acid is, and more of a preventative way there too to look at and see how that trends over time.
And David Perlmutter released a book recently called Drop Acid, which I haven't read it, but that's probably a deep dive on all of these issues.
Okay. Anybody else got some questions before we?
Yeah, the last roundtable I did, there were so many questions we didn't get them all answered.
I know we were leaving lots of time tonight, but we got a pondering crew. Lee, do you know if there's any of these studies that look at, I didn't see it, but I haven't been looking extremely hard for this specific thing, but you reminded me of it. Is there any studies that go through, like have any tracking or analysis of a microbiome change with mushroom consumption relating to metabolic health? Have you seen that? Or is that just my brain wanting that and that's too advanced?
Those studies exist in animals for sure.
Yeah.
But I don't think I can't think of a study in humans.
Yeah.
But the animal data is impressive. And you can, using the water soluble polysaccharides from reishi, for example, you can give those to rats, and you can feed the rats a high fat diet, and they don't develop the same weight gain, and they have their metabolic markers aren't as significantly off as the rats without those reishi polysaccharides. And then if you give the reishi polysaccharides to normally fed mice with rats with their normal chow, and then if you do a fecal transplant into the high fat fed rats, it alters their microbiome and it has an impact on their weight gain and their metabolic markers. So the changes that are taking place with the consumption of the mushroom polysaccharides are creating alterations which are long-lived and can be transplanted and the results reproduced.
Wow, fascinating.
Yeah. And there's a lot we don't know about the short chain fatty acids. So, we talk about butyrate, acetate, and propionate, but there's a bunch of other ones, and there's some branched short chain fatty acids. There's medium chain fatty acids. and they have receptors that receive their signals. So there's G protein coupled receptors. They've all got numbers like 43 and 119 and 109. So these receptors are expressed in all different tissues of the body, and they regulate a whole bunch of different functions. So the global effects that we get from alterations in the production of these short chain fatty acids, their influences can be traced back to these interactions with these particular receptors. So these things are sour. So hibiscus is probably the most well-known sour medicine, and it can lower blood pressure. So there's sour receptors that control smooth muscle relaxation and contraction in vascular tissue, for example, and those sour receptors are the same ones that the short chain fatty acids that can interact with. So the blood pressure lowering properties of a mushroom, could well relate to just increases in those particular short chain fatty acids that can interact with those particular receptors, in the blood vessels to do that. But they're expressed widely in the body, and they can, they're in the pancreas and the liver, and they're in many places. So there's a lot that we don't know about all of the curious interactions between all of the other short chain fatty acids and the medium chain fatty acids, and the interaction with these receptors. So I think that story still has a lot of legs still to play out. I think we're going to learn a lot more in the near future, and with the new techniques around understanding easily how to examine the microbiome and the microbiota, we're in a much better place to do that. And I've started doing that in a clinical setting where I'm getting patients to do a stool analysis and getting a snapshot of all of the bacteria in the gut, and then comparing it, in time to see the changes in diversity and improvements in the particular ratios of the organisms. And mushrooms do have the ability to show up changes. So it doesn't make any kind of obvious sense, but you can increase the diversity of your bowel flora just by consuming mushrooms. So you can have different organisms in there, after a period of eating mushrooms. So, mushrooms have got this ability to deliver or create an environment where there's a new species going to be present, which is quite fascinating.
Yeah, that diversity topic is huge, and just, makes me reinforce that fact that we want to, encourage folks to rotate mushrooms if they're not using them, for a specific reason. Getting that diversity of those different fibers and those molecular compounds that Lee was talking about, and even different flushes or fruits of mushrooms from us at Real Mushrooms. They all have varying levels of active compounds, so they're always kind of a different chemotype in the herbal medicine world, but in the mushroom world, same thing. Different things. So good for the diversity of your gut and your patient's guts, for sure.
Yeah, but it's the regularity that's important, and we have to change the patient's mindset around what a healthy life looks like. So you're up against sedentary lifestyles and freely accessible inappropriate food. So it can be quite a challenge to get people to to change those habits. And I don't know if the clinicians on the call tonight have the same issue that I do, but 2 or 3 months into a patient protocol and the patient's doing really well, they've no longer got the problems that they came in, that addressed, and it's like they develop amnesia all of a sudden, and they think that they don't need to continue on with the therapy, so they go away and they think that they're cured. And then 6 months later they come back and said, "Oh, I'm sorry, like all these things have come back. I stopped, what I was doing." It's a continuous process of education, and having mushrooms available as powders, I find that can be consumed as a hot drink or sprinkled on food. So tremella and lion's mane, I have patients mix it into their yogurt on their breakfast, for example, if they don't want to consume hot drinks during the day, or that's not part of their normal routine. So those two mushrooms are, particularly tasty. So it helps to teach the patient that it's not just about supplementing, as a capsule or a tablet, or a ghastly tasting, liquid herbal extract. And Mason, you've got all those teas in the background there, having patients, mixing up various, tea concoctions, plays a role, but it is difficult.
Yeah, it's difficult for that. Adding some sweet, definitely helpful for some of the bitter ones. Sour is a nice overarching flavor to mix in there. But yeah, always those lifestyle things for me as well, just trying to keep people motivated and keep them dedicated. And yeah, I find some people are really objective based. They want to see those numbers. They want to see their stool test change, or they want to see their fasting insulin come down or whatever. But finding what motivates each person, I find has been helpful for me. And I love working with accountants. They just like, where are the numbers? Give me the numbers. Show me the beans. We're counting the beans here. Great patience, I find. Jokes aside, but yeah. I see that some people are heading out, so thanks for joining us. We'll have this replay in about a week's time. Christy, do you have a question, or are you leaving? Oh, you're muted. Oh, I think she's just saying hello. Okay. Any final questions, remarks? I want to give Lee some time to go over his course and for us to wrap up here. I can try to unmute you, Christy, if you want to. Oh, she can't. I see. Got it. We'll just let people ask any questions in the final time here. And then Lee, do you want me to, are you going to share anything, or are you just going to chat in terms of video?
I was just going to chat. Yeah. So perhaps to wrap up the metabolic part, in clinic, when I've got a patient with metabolic syndrome, the overall kind of mindset and strategy that I adopt is to understand which are the core dysfunctions. So, lipids, blood sugar, obesity, blood pressure. So which of those ones need to be dealt with? How extreme is each one? Because it isn't always possible to have or even contemplate giving a remedy for each particular thing, so there's lots of overlap that we get, with the medicine. So it's about trying to assess how they all fit together. I always understand what the comorbidities are, and are they dominant, in terms of the way that the patient presents. So, it might be a slow development of something, so it isn't as crucial to worry about. That long list of targets that I went through, or the key focus areas, I always, sometimes I write it down, often I'll just do it in my head. I'll go through a checklist and make a note of the ones that need to be focused on in this patient, because it isn't possible to do everything in the first consult. You need to develop a plan that goes over, 2 or 3 or 4 months. So some things that, aren't as important, can be left, to be dealt with later on. I always just as a default, I assume that there's faulty microcirculation. So I've always got some aspect of the treatment that is going to be focused on, particularly looking after endothelial health in the patient. So that doesn't have to be a pill or a supplement. It can be dietary change. So I think of, blueberries or any of those polyphenolic berries, blackberries, strawberries, raspberries. Regular consumption of those is very highly beneficial for the vascular endothelium. High cocoa chocolate, so 85% or higher, or raw cacao nibs or raw cacao powder. Cinnamon, I use a lot of cinnamon zeylanicum in clinic. I buy cinnamon bark, I grind it up myself so it's nice and fresh, and patients take a teaspoon a day, and that can be mixed with yogurt. It's actually quite tasty, much cheaper than buying a supplement. Green tea is an ideal adjunct in that endothelial category, but also increasing dietary spices. So I encourage patients to use more culinary spices in their cooking. So there are some rules that I get people to adopt, like never eat red meat without having spices on it. So it's always got to have rosemary or sage or cumin or, whatever it is, the dish that you're cooking. So that helps to address the microcirculation. And then reishi probably, for me, plays a big role there. But in a herbal world, grapeseed and gotu kola for me are sort of integral. Maybe ginkgo as well. So, and then I put emphasis on the diet and the exercise and body weight management. And then, based on, all of that information, I then create a formula of liquids and tablets that, address all of the key issues. And it's taken me a while now, but almost every patient gets some sort of mushroom therapy, which is, just in the last few years, that's been quite a change in my clinical practice. I used to think that mushrooms were just, for cancer treatment and as an adjunct in cancer patients. So I think it was that realization as a result of working with Don Lawson. Don and I worked at Aduco for a year together. He was quite a big influence over my thinking around being more curious about mushrooms. And that led me to the idea that I should, extend my herbal education to include mushroom education as well at the practitioner level, because I recognized that there wasn't any quality education offerings available to the practitioner community. And what was available was, relatively low key and, not deep enough in the way that it dealt, with the subject matter. So I'm almost embarrassed to say that it's taken me way longer than I thought to get it ready. It's not just about, the understanding the subject. I think I underestimated just how vast, the subject matter was and how much research and reading was necessary to get deeply into it. And it takes time for me for ideas to mature and to get a proper understanding of how to position mushrooms into an environment where someone who's trained to use herbs, which is what the focus really is. So practitioners that are currently using herbs and supplements but not yet using mushrooms but want to use mushrooms, how do mushrooms fit into that way of thinking? So part of that, it's not an academic exercise. You've got to actually do it and practice it yourself. So part of the time issue has been me just getting the clinical experience to make me feel at least confident that I can talk with some sort of authority. So I probably not at the point where I've got the level of clinical experience that would make me like the clinical expert, but the fact that I've been doing this for 30 years allows me to cut a few corners. And I have had some quite significant clinical experience. I don't see many cancer patients, but I've had a couple recently. I had a patient with lung cancer. She had 3 different lung cancers identified in both lobes of the lung, and she sent me the scan recently. So then I started seeing her in May of this year, and she's now totally free of the cancer. All that's left is scar tissue. And the surgeon said, well, I've never seen this drug Targrisso work so well before, and was totally deaf, to the patient's, comments around what else she was doing to, support her through that process. It wasn't just the drug. And I've got a pancreatic cancer patient at the moment. I've had a few of those. It's a difficult disease to treat, and it's very sad when they pass away. They're only 4%, 5% survival rate. So this patient I've been seeing for 12 weeks now, and there's no longer any cancer in the pancreas, and the metastasis in the liver has shrunk since the last scan from 14 centimeters to 7 centimeters, so it's 50% reduced. And the doctors have said, well, we can alter your chemo schedule now, so instead of 3 weekly intervals, we can go to 5 weekly intervals. The patient has more energy and vitality, and they're now developing a survivor mentality, whereas before they were feeling like they weren't going to survive because of the odds were against them. So these things have given me a bit more confidence. And then the other thing that's taken me a lot of time is just is my own personal issues around being in public and all that baggage that's much more openly talked about in today's world, with particularly in the psychedelic communities that I inhabit online, where dealing with the traumas of our past. It doesn't have to be horrific traumas that we often associate when we hear that word, but we all have to deal with the upbringings that we've had. And for me, I've been dealing with the issues of not being good enough and not being worthy that don't make any logical sense, but they're quite significant emotional hurdles to get over. So I've been doing a lot of work on that myself to get over those hurdles. So the product that I've nearly got complete, I'm going to divide it into 3 parts. And the first part will be an introduction to why we need to use mushrooms, why we need to change our thinking and incorporate mushrooms, into a lifestyle. Because the Western world is, even though it's changing quite rapidly, it's still largely mycophobic, and we need to change that. So the first offering is about changing the mindset. It's about introducing practitioners to all of the individual constituents in mushrooms in a clinically relevant way, because you could bore yourself, crazy by just going mindlessly through all of the details and the research, but tell a story around, why are beta glucans important? What are the receptors that they interact with? What do those receptors do? How does that impact on the way that the immune system works? How does it impact on some new and interesting areas that have been discovered recently around trained immunity and the way that we can up or down regulate the immune system via these mechanisms? So in the topic we've just been talking about today, the chronic inflammatory status, particularly in the cardiovascular system, is an aspect of trained innate immunity, where immune cells become tolerant, so they're no longer responsive, to these messages. And oxidized LDL is an entrainer of the immune system, and beta glucans have the ability to untrain those cells to reduce the inflammation. So in telling the story around all of the various constituents, so we go on a lot about beta glucans, but beta glucans are only one aspect of that polysaccharide world, and beta glucans by all means aren't just one thing. There's there's literally hundreds of different permutations and combinations, but there's alpha glucans, there's chitin, so ergosterol, there's that whole gamut of ergothioneine that would be discussed in the first part. And then how do mushrooms influence human health? So why do I need to be focused on mushrooms in clinic? So as we were just talking today, there'd be a piece on metabolic health. So there'd be a section on non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, metabolic syndrome, cardiovascular disease. There'll be a section on how do mushrooms fit into immune maintenance, how do mushrooms fit into acute immune situations, how do they play a role in cancer? Although I won't go deeply into cancer, that's a separate subject. So that first part will be 8 hours long. It'll be four 2-hour sessions. And I'm going to start in November with a small cohort just as a trial run to get feedback, to tidy it up, make sure that there's no, kind of issues that are left. And then that'll be made available, broadly in the new year to the practitioner community. Part 2 will be a deep dive on 9 individual mushrooms. So the ones that we've talked about today. I won't name them all, but there's 9 individual mushrooms. I've written a monograph for each one, which is like a proper scientific monograph, maybe 50 to 70 references on each document that summarize all of the research. And on 2 or 3 pages, give you all of the clinical information at the gross level that you need to, think about using them in clinic. And then at the back of the monograph, there's a brief summary of all of the human clinical trials that I've been able to access to give you guidance on or confidence on where to use that mushroom supported by clinical evidence. And then each of those mushrooms, I've written a discussion document which summarizes all of the major aspects of the research. And I may make that available as part of that offering. I just finished the Ganoderma one and it's 11,000 words. So if I put them all together, it's probably a little book. So that will be a 1.5 hour video for each mushroom. I'll probably combine chaga and maitake because there's not as much to talk about on those two. Chaga is a fascinating mushroom or sclerotium. There's a lot to talk about on it, but in terms of, clinical evidence, there's hardly any. So they could be combined together. So I'm going to have 8 mushroom sessions that would go through each mushroom. And then at the end of that session, talk about how to integrate that mushroom into a clinical practice. So what herbs combine well with lion's mane, for example. So give some highlights and some very rough kind of indicators of, well, if you've got someone with dementia, then you'd use these herbs and I'd use lion's mane, and I'd also use tremella. And then the third part is going to be a rolling monthly deep dive on an individual disease state with not necessarily just a focus on mushrooms, but a focus on the whole clinical aspect, like how would you deal with type 2 diabetes? What mushrooms, what herbs, etc. And then I'll do that as long as I've got material for. So that's an outline of the program. My handle on Instagram is called Herba_Meditari. So that's my company name. That's what I'm going to call that's the name of the website. That's going to be the education school. So Herba means, all things natural that are medicinal, and meditari means to ponder and to examine and to scrutinize and to meditate upon. So, that's going to be my online school that people will be able to, get that information that's mostly focused on, mushroom education. And my functional herbal therapy program, which is just purely focused on medicinal herbs, is still available through Society of Wellness that run that program. But I'm no longer producing content for that organisation. I'm just doing it on my own. So thank you, Mason, for allowing me the time to share that vision that I've got. So those of you that have been waiting, you don't have much longer to wait. And Joni and I will start getting our heads together around, contacting people, doing marketing, that sort of thing.
Thanks, Lee. Yeah, you've been a real big asset to everybody in this room and all the talks we've had. So happy to learn more, and I'm really excited. And I put the link in there for anybody to get on Lee's newsletter and his.
Thanks, Mason.
It's just in the chat, but we'll send it all out with all of our lists to Lee, and with the recording of this as well. So I really appreciate Lee coming and holding down the fort here with the metabolic discussion and the questions that emerged. And I think we're going to head off here soon, unless there's any final remarks. Again, we're going to be meeting next month for a veterinarian focused roundtable, and then we've got a few more human practitioner focused roundtables set up for October and November. And we're going to take a break in December just to give everybody a nice holiday breather from mushrooms, although I'm sure turkey dinner will have some mushrooms after tonight's conversation.
Yes. Every dinner will have mushrooms.
Yeah, no kidding, eh?
Yep.
Okay, well, nice to see everybody.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Lee. Thanks, Rob.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Mason, Joni, Rob. See you. Bye, everyone.